We're continuing our series on theology of the body, so God's plan for human sexuality. And today we're going to consider one of the most profound ideas of St. John Paul II. It's called the language of the body. And basically, the insight here is that not only do we communicate with our bodies, but we can tell a truth or a lie with our body. So I'll give you 3 examples. So if someone in our family always belittles us and then gives us a hug, without saying sorry, well, that hug is a lie. Let's say I sell you my car, but I don't tell you about the damage on it, and then we shake hands. Well, that handshake is now a lie. I've tricked you. And finally, one time I asked a man, and I said, I think your wife is always falling asleep when I preach because her head goes like this. And he said, no, Father, no, it's because she's agreeing with you. She's saying, yes, Father, yes. I said, okay, makes sense. So we talked about last week that God has designed sexuality. And God has actually put a language into sexuality, into marriage. So when husband and wife love each other, it's supposed to say something, and it's supposed to speak a truth. So we see this language of the body in the second reading, but in a different application. It's applied to the Eucharist, the celebration of Mass. So let me give you the context. Basically, St. Paul's writing to the Christians in Corinth, and he's writing about the way they celebrate Mass, and he sees abuses, 2 abuses. So first of all, he says that some people are dressing inappropriately for Mass against Jewish custom. The second problem is that there are divisions in the community. So at that time in history, Christians were celebrating Mass in homes. And before they went to Mass, celebrated Mass, they would have a regular meal. And there are 2 groups. They're separating into 2 groups. They're separating into the rich Christians and the poor ones. And the rich Christians had a lot of food to eat before Mass. The poor sometimes had no food. And so St. Paul is very upset about this. The Christians are being separated before Mass. Why does this upset him so much? Because it's against the language of the body, the language of the Eucharist, because the language of the Eucharist is supposed to be about unity. So this is what he says. He says, "What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter I do not commend you. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood.'" The Eucharist speaks the language of unity. And so this idea that Christians, they're taking the Eucharist and then they're not loving each other, he says that's a lie with the body. Okay, so he goes on further. And the following is the reason why Catholics were so concerned about the Eucharist. This is our highest sacrament. We have very clear standards about how to receive the Eucharist. St. Paul says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be answerable for the body and blood of the Lord. Examine yourselves, and only then eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For all who eat and drink without discerning the body eat and drink judgment against themselves." That's an incredible teaching of St. Paul. And as I've said before, there's some Protestants, they look at this teaching and they say, okay, that's amazing. It's got to be more than a symbol. The Eucharist can't just be a symbol. If you're actually going to be answerable to the Lord, you're actually going to bring judgment upon yourself. So we know if you're going to take Holy Communion, all of us, you better recognize this is the body of Jesus. Otherwise, you bring judgment upon yourself. And St. Paul continues, "For this reason, many of you are weak and ill, and some have died." That's a very strong teaching. People are taking the Eucharist unworthily, and it's actually causing them harm. So a way to understand this is, let's say you're allergic to penicillin. So if you take that, what normally would help you actually hurts you. And that's why if we take the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin, it doesn't help you. You know how sometimes we really want to receive the Eucharist, and even though we kind of know we shouldn't, if we do take it, it doesn't help us. It actually hurts us. So this reminds us of a principle in life, the principle of desecration. When you take something sacred and you treat it in an ordinary way, it becomes a desecration. If you damage my car, that's not a desecration, it's just an object. But if you damage an object to which we attach special importance, well, that's worse. If you hurt a person, well, a person is sacred, so you're starting to get into desecration. And if you offend the Eucharist, which is the highest, the most sacred thing is Jesus himself, that's the highest form of desecration. So let's connect this teaching on the Eucharist with theology of the body. So the language of the Eucharist is connected to the language of marriage, and it's connected to the language of sexuality. Why? Why are all these three connected? Because they all have to do with self-giving. We talked about that 3 weeks ago. The Mass, the Eucharist, is about self-giving. That's what marriage is about. That's what sexuality is about. They're all about self-giving. This is what St. Augustine says. Like a bridegroom, Christ went forth from his nuptial chamber. That's heaven. He came even to the marriage bed of the cross, and there, ascending it, he consummated a marriage. And when he sensed the creature sighing in her breath, he surrendered himself to torment for his bride in a communication of love. What was Jesus saying when he was on the cross with his body? He was saying, I love you all freely, faithfully, totally, and fruitfully. Jesus is the bridegroom. That's the way he loves his bride, those 4 qualities. And those are the 4 qualities of marriage. If we don't have these 4 qualities in marriage, St. John Paul II would say, you're telling a lie. So I'll give you an example. Let's say someone is forced to get married, and they come to the wedding. That would be a lie with the body because it's not truly free. But let's say someone cheats on their spouse. That's not faithful. That's a lie with the body. Let's say people have sex before marriage. That's also a lie with the body because it's not total, right? You're not committed for life. And then to use contraception, that's also a lie because we're saying that our love is not fruitful. So we're going to bring these points together to conclude it all next week. But for today, we're just going to focus on the Eucharist because it's Corpus Christi Sunday, the feast of the body and blood of Christ. And what we want to remember is that Mass is a wedding banquet. So the bridegroom gives his body to us. And what is he saying with his body? He's saying, I love you. I'm giving everything to you. So what do we want to say with our body when we receive Holy Communion? So we're going to focus on the interior first, because that's most important. If we receive Jesus' body, the heart needs to be prepared. We want to be in a state of grace. We don't want to have any mortal sins, because let's say I missed Mass last week, and then I want to take communion today. Well, I'm saying with my body, Jesus, I'm not fully committed to you. We don't want to say that. We want to go to confession first. Second, externally, once our heart is prepared, we're going to speak with our body. First of all, I think Deacon Andrew and I should slow down the way we give communion, because I think sometimes we might rush. So we want to do a bit better. Mass might take a bit longer, but that's okay because it's worth the sign value. When you receive communion, you want to be prayerful, joyful. You want to be concentrating. So receive Jesus with care. Don't rush. So when you receive communion, don't take the communion away from you while you're standing up, right? Always just receive kneeling. That's the right way. So parents, you need to remind your children about this, because a lot of children are walking away with the Eucharist. Whether we receive communion on the tongue or in the hand, the Church lets us decide. Neither one says we're holier. But as I've said every year, I personally favor receiving communion on the tongue just because of the sign value. In our modern culture, we don't receive food this way because we never receive food from another person directly into our mouths. So it's a sign it's not ordinary food. And this helped me a lot when I was young. My family told me to receive communion this way. And it just reminded me, okay, this is something special. And I've known a lot of other people who felt that blessing. If we do receive communion on the hand, show Jesus that he's the king. So you make a throne for a king. It's beautiful. You do it for him. You do it for yourself to remind you, wow, I'm receiving God. And so if you're also wearing a mask, also pull the mask down first, and then you receive, just very lovingly. So again, parents, please remind your children about this, because I see some children sometimes manhandling Jesus. They grab him, and they're just like this. It looks like they have no idea what they're doing, because I don't think they're doing it intentionally, but the sign doesn't look good. It's not communicating our love. And finally, let's dress beautifully for Mass. We mentioned this a few years ago. It's just a good reminder to wear our best insofar as possible. We're going to just dress a step up for Mass, something beautiful, appropriate, respectful, that makes us feel good. We're saying with our clothing, the language of the body, hey, I'm receiving Jesus. This is the highlight of my week. And during the summer, we're going to turn up the air conditioning really powerfully, just to make sure everyone, maybe the guys are wearing suits and the women dress up. Okay. St. John Paul II wrote the following, with italics included. He said, "The Eucharist is the sacrament of our redemption. It is the sacrament of the bridegroom and the bride." There's the marriage right there. Mass is a wedding. And this is the reason why Dr. Christopher West, he always shares this story. He tells a story about his father-in-law. His father-in-law, the day after he got married, he goes to Mass with his new wife. And during communion, after he's praying in the pew, he's crying. His wife asks him, "Why are you crying?" And he says, because he's thinking about the consummation of their marriage the night before. And he says to his wife, "For the first time in my life, I now understand the meaning of Jesus' words. This is my body given for you." So he understood, he connected the language of the body in marriage and the language of Jesus' body during Mass.